So you all have your quizzes in front of you. We'll go through this as quickly as possible, but as efficiently as possible. Answer any questions you may have while we're going through this. Write any fix anything so you don't make the same mistakes on the test, either on your quiz, on a separate sheet of paper, on the back, something. Great, so I'm going to start with the calculator section. I'm trying to remember exactly because I graded these like over the weekend, so I don't really remember. Common mistakes. So I'll just talk in general between all the classes that I've taken this. For the most part, we did fine for these two. There were some minor issues. We should have distributed. This would have been 15 to 6 or 5 halves if you simplified. Plus 6. If you didn't get plus 6, that was an issue. It messed up the rest. Some of you combined like terms. Some of you started moving. That order did not matter. And then you had choices. So what you chose to move at that time again was up to you. So some of you moved this and added 7. So that we would get, this would be 6 over 2, which some of you just added in your calculator, which simplified to 3x. And then divided both sides by 6 to get x equals 6. So that was the correct answer for that one. The 4 points were, did you distribute correctly? Do the work to get 3x, whatever that looked like, do the work to get 18, whatever that looked like, and then get the final answer. Questions on that one? Number 2, you have to cross multiply, which most of us did. Make sure you're multiplying diagonal, not directly across. Distribute so that you have 8n plus 64 equals 7n plus 70. And then you had choices as to what you wanted to move. Many of us moved the 7n over and the 64 at the same time to get n equals 6. It was coincidence that these both were the same number. That won't always happen. Questions on that one or this section in general? So this was the score, the total number of points was added to your non-calculator section, so we'll get to that here in a moment. For the second section, your absolute value, we need to isolate first. So get rid of the 7 by adding. Some of you were getting rid of the 1/3 by multiplying first, which is fine if you do that to everything. So remember, we have this pick and choose, we have to do it to everything. So then we multiply or put this and multiply or divide. Some of you divided by 1/3, that was fine. To get rid of this so that it's just 4 minus x equals 7. We should have been leaving it in the absolute value up until this point, then dropping it and setting it equal to a positive and negative 27. Then from there, solving, so getting rid of the 4s by subtracting. At this point, some of us just wrote these as the answer, 23, negative 31, but we should have divided everything by -1. So that the solution was negative 23, positive 30. Remember that you had your calculator, you could have put these back in to the original to see does this work or does this not. So if you had 23 negative 31, that was incorrect. It should have been the opposite. Make sure it's least to greatest. So the 5 points on that one were, did you isolate correctly up until this point? Set up your two equations, so that was 2 points. Solve it correctly to get the final answer. Do you have any questions on that one? The last one was like hit or miss. Some of us got this, some of us did not. When we added 16 to the other side, we got negative 36. We cannot solve this any longer. There's no solution. So if you did that, you got both points. If you started to solve it after that, that is not what you should have done. Or if you didn't leave it in absolute value, you got less points because you didn't isolate correctly to show that that would have been no solution, which is why you kept solving. If you had taken the number that you gotten and put it back in, they wouldn't have worked. Any questions on that? Really want to start the next one if this falls over, but. In the word problems, you should have read, found anything important. So for number 5, most of us got that one right. Important things, $10 per day, plus a $20 one-time fee, registration fee, the total cost was 90. We had to write and solve an equation to find out how many days. So the very first thing you should have done was define your variable. The question helps you do that. Just find how many days he rented the bike. So you can let E number of days. You can use whatever variable you want. Then for our equation, we know the total cost is 90, so it's going to equal 90. It's $10 per day, so the per means the 10 and the variable are going to go together, plus the 20. So your equation should have looked something like this. And then we could have solved. We got rid of 20 and divided both sides by 20. Make sure you're putting labels. We can't just put 7 since this is a real world problem. So if you see what this for day. Go to the left, thanks, Sarah. Okay, let's finish. Do we have any questions on 5 before we do 6? Six was probably most of us. Some of us got it, some of us did not. So the length is 5 inches more than 4 times its width. The perimeter is 90. We have to write and solve an equation to find the dimensions. Slam. We need to find L and W. So for this one, we know L is 5 plus 4W. And then our perimeter equation is P equals 2L plus 2W. So if you don't remember this perimeter equation, at the very least, draw a rectangle, and put like the length on one side, and then on the other side, put width on both sides. That way I can see somehow how you added things up. Remember that perimeter is adding up all the sides, so at least do that if you don't remember this. Put this in for L and change P to 90. So 90 equals 2 times 5 plus 4W plus 3W. Some of us were just putting 90 equals 5 plus 4W, which is just the perimeter equals half of the length, or like 1 of the lengths. That wouldn't be right. And then distribute. And then we can combine like terms and solve. So that we get, subtract 10 on both sides, 80 equals 10W. And if we divide both sides, we get 8 inches, I think. Yes.
Yes.
Right, so that was one part, but then you had to go back and find length by putting 8 into W here. 5 plus 4 times 8. 5 plus 32, or length was 37 meters. So the 5 points on that word, did you set up your length equation correctly, your perimeter equation correctly, the work to find width and length, and then the width and length themselves? Questions on that one? And then go on to the no calculator page. For objective 3, most of us got 7 right. Make sure you're doing whatever to both sides. If we're getting y by itself, get rid of ax by subtracting. Divide both sides by d. Nothing would simplify here, so just y equals c minus ax all over b. Was that final answer? Most of us got that. 2 points. Did you subtract correctly and divide correctly to get the final answer? But 8 though, there was an issue. So most of us, many of us, multiplied m on both sides. But what you really did was just create more m's. Because the b wouldn't get, you would just have m squared on the other side. So to get rid of the b, we have to multiply so that it gets out of the denominator and then divide by d. So if you got that, that was correct, but if you got something else, that was not. Did we have questions on that one? That was probably the most important. Nine was right or wrong. So if you see something that's 3 equals 3, that is infinitely many. That would be the equivalent of 0 equals 0. If you were solving one step at a time, let's say you got rid of your variables and then you were just left with the numbers, that would be what it looks like. Unless you subtract the numbers as well, then it would be 0 equals 0. So that should have been infinitely many. No solution is when there are 2 different numbers, and the top 3 is x equals 3, x equals 6, x equals 0. So if it doesn't say x equals, those top 3 are not choices. Questions on that one? Right, and then the last one, we needed to distribute and combine the terms to start to solve. Most of us got this one. There were some minor issues, so be careful with your negatives, moving things back and forth. You had choices of what you wanted to move. And at the end, when you divide, you should have got 12. So your 5 points, did you distribute correctly, combine your like terms, solve to get 2x, solve to get 24, and then the correct answer. Do we have any questions on that? Anything in general about the test? Do that one more time. So since we just went over it, no, but the test is gonna replace it, the quiz. Other questions? Yes.
For question 6, I don't want to talk about it.
So because this had W in it, when we put this into the equation, all we had were W, so that's what we saw for first. Did that answer your question right there? Right, you guys are gonna start off with the no calculator section, so go ahead and put your calculator behind your phone or in the pocket.